Start the lunch and learn, the learn part of the lunch and learn. I hope you enjoyed lunch, those of you here in person. Welcome to those of you who may be joining us online for our lunch and learn today. Welcome to Trinity-Grace. Today we are delighted to have Karen Giesbrecht here. Welcome, Karen. Karen is a registered dietitian with a particular interest in mental health, strong communities, good stories, and real food. I think I would be interested in those things too, especially the real food. She works with Union Gospel Mission, the Salvation Army Harbor Light, and several other local community food programs. Karen wove all these together in Happy Happy Soul, an exploration of why and how we share food, and 2 children's books that playfully explore the same ideas. At home in Vancouver, Karen takes great delight in sharing good meals with her family, friends, and those in her community who know hunger. And Karen has a website, www.karengiesbrecht.com. Over to you, Karen. Let you introduce your background.
Thank you. So thank you for having me. And the other point of connection I have is I'm a neighbor. I tell people I live in Mount Pleasant, but if I'm honest, or if we're going to get technical, I live in Riley Park because I'm on 17th Avenue and Mount Pleasant ends at 16th Avenue. So I have for about the last 12 years had the privilege of getting to explore and understand food access here in Vancouver. And so we are going to spend the next little while talking about this. And so just to start, by means of starting to think about the question, I'm going to throw out, what questions do you have about food security when you think about food access in Vancouver for our own health?
Well, I'm not quite sure how the food banks operate necessarily all the time. But what happens if you need something and you go to a food bank and you can't source? You can't do a special diet, or say you have young children. What resources do people have then?
So question about, for those who have particular dietary needs, how do they meet their food needs if they need, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's especially expensive now to buy formula for babies. I mean, it's great if you can breastfeed your child yourself, but some people can't, so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or if they're working, whatever, so that's the big concern.
Right, we're all talking about cost of food, and then again, some of these specialty items like formula for little ones or meal replacement supplements for people with higher nutrient needs. Yeah, yeah.
And kind of like on that note, it's just like the way that grocery dollars are reallocated to things like diapers and stuff that aren't
Mm-hmm.
covered, and how that takes away from grocery budgets.
Right, food is just one need. We have a lot of hygiene needs and other household basic necessities, let alone transportation and communication and those. Yes.
You know, we weren't imperfect vegetables. You know, instead of going to Safeway and seeing them all so perfect, you know what? You know, have really, yeah,
Right.
to really focus on, hey, everybody, there's a lot of imperfect vegetables that are going down the tube.
We have, yeah, food waste and rescued food. We're going to touch base on that one a little bit today. Yeah, good question. Mm-hmm.
And ignorance, you know, the innocent ignorance of not knowing how to cook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, food literacy is the bigger term, but cooking skills.
Learning how to use a sharp knife, a cutting board, and a steamer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. We can't lose some of those skills for sure. Mm-hmm.
Civil society, is it really civil society's responsibility to take care of people who are food insecure? It's a basic human right.
Food should be a right, and whose responsibility is it? If we're going to ask questions like that, you have to give me until 5 o'clock to. Yeah. So 2 things I really like is 1, maps, and 2, terminology. And so we'll go through a few terms, which you'll probably be familiar with some of them, some might be new, and a couple of maps of Vancouver that I found just looking at our city in different ways. And I already had a comment. This map up here, you see Vancouver, and it does not include the University Endowment Lands, UBC, as part of Vancouver technically. But food access for students and those living on campus is certainly something that there is a lot of conversation around. And so the terms that we use when we talk about food and food security really matter, because how we talk about something impacts how we frame issues, and thus impacts what we understand are the root causes, and therefore how we respond. And I got to be part of a group connected with the Vantage Point, which is looking at food access and nonprofits across BC. And we did a project about a year ago where, maybe it was 2 years ago, leading up to our recent election, we were trying to just get people talking about food security more, and that's where some of these terminology comes from. And so one definition of food security is what it's not, and food security, or addressing food security, is not food charity. For some of these reasons brought up already, that food banks cannot meet a lot of the needs of people who are food insecure. So let's talk about first the definition of insecure. It's a term you're familiar with. It means to be not firmly fixed. Something that is insecure is liable to give away or break. If we're referring to a person who is insecure, that means they're not very confident or maybe uncertain or anxious. And there's three main types of insecurity. So one, personal insecurity, where we are overly critical of ourselves, and that's often our body image or our ability to perform. Or relationship insecurity, where we don't have supporting and trusting relationships in our life. And so we might be insecure about one particular relationship, or for others, it's a feeling about all their relationships in their life. And somebody who has relationship insecurity might feel just uncertain about how much they are loved or trusted or protected. And then the third type of insecurity is domain-specific insecurity, and that is where we are insecure about a specific aspect or resource in our life. So often food, finances, health, our safety. And one of the real important things is this type of security, it's a problem of access and resources, not personal failure. So food insecurity is a domain-specific insecurity. When we think about food insecurity, we often think about hunger, the desire to eat, and often the response is food charity, food banks, food hamper programs, soup kitchens. These meals are free or highly subsidized, or for some, as we were just talking about, the 411 Senior Center has a meal and it's $5, which compared to a restaurant it is subsidized, but for a lot of people who are low income, that's still a barrier. So food security, how would you define it? Mm-hmm.
Having it available at an affordable price, proportionate to your income.
Yeah, so our access to food, there's enough, affordable, yeah. Appropriate for our health, for our physical needs, for our culture.
And the ability to prepare it, as in there's a kitchen.
Right? Yeah.
You pick out a key, you can open it, and there's salt and pepper.
Right. We could give somebody a bag of groceries, but if they don't have a kitchen, or we can even give somebody a can of tuna, and if they don't have a can opener, yeah. Yeah, I think we've got most of the important things. Food security is the right to, or the measure of access to food, which is affordable, meets our needs, it's nutritious, culturally appropriate, obtained with dignity, sustainably grown, and I would add, delicious, which we would all define quite differently. Obtained with dignity is one piece of food security, and so there is a lot of shame for people who have to access food through a food bank, even if there could be enough food to meet our dietary needs, and there was baby formula for those who need babies. Still, it's a challenge, especially if we've got to take a bus, carry heavy groceries, we've got some mobility challenges, or a little one that we've got to be tagging along. And so many, many things we think about, not just the bag of groceries. Food insecurity, then, is the state of being without reliable access to food that meets all these criteria. And what's important is because of factors outside of one's control. And so we're going to talk about a couple of those factors. And we also talk about the idea of a household food insecurity. So that's the inadequate access to food because of finances. We understand that ultimately it is only because when we have an income that we can ensure we have enough food and the food we want to eat, that we can treat ourselves once in a while with amazing food from local caterers. And low-income households, not surprisingly, struggle to afford adequate food, and which has ripple effects through physical health, through mental health, through social well-being. When we don't have enough food for ourselves, we can't host our community, we can't celebrate. Many factors are impacted. And when we talk about food insecurity, we talk about 3 levels. So marginal means that people worry a little bit about running out of food, or they might have to limit their selection because they can't afford all sorts of different kinds of food. Moderate food insecurity is when they start to compromise the quality or the quantity of what they eat. And then severe food insecurity is when people start to miss meals, reduce their food intake, and at a most extreme, go for days without food. And so this might be a little hard to see, but this is showing some of the connection between some common ailments and the different levels of food insecurity. So has anyone here either experienced themselves or known someone who has had back problems, headache, heart disease, a little bit of anxiousness, something we've all experienced? And what we can see, the orange bar there, is people who are food secure, if we have enough. We all experience some of these things, but to a much lesser degree versus the dark blue bar. The more food insecure we are, the more some of these challenges are amplified. And it's a little bit of chicken and egg. If you have back pain, that means you can't work and you can't carry groceries and can't get things, which means we don't eat as well, which just amplifies all of the challenges. So when we talk about food security, we also talk about food access at a community level. And so that's the measure of food access and availability here in our neighborhood or in our city, considering community self-reliance, social justice, and sustainability. So in Vancouver, we're pretty fortunate. We have a lot of different ways that we can access food, but in some of our remote communities, this becomes much more important to talk about and consider. And then when we talk about all of this, one of the terms we'll often use is the social determinants of health. And so those are all the conditions in the environment where we live, where we play, where we work, where we worship, where we gather, that affect our health and our ability to function. So for example, the water quality, the access to food, schools, employment, housing, neighborhoods, community spaces, all of these impact us. So this is a picture from the Vancouver Food Asset Map and showing just the community food organizations and the free or low-cost meals. And so it does look like there are quite a number of assets available. The sort of orange dots, those are religious institutions. So it really shows that a lot of food is provided by the faith community. But you'll notice there are parts of the city where there are not a lot of food assets. So the downtown east side, downtown Vancouver, there's quite a concentration of assets. Our neighborhood here, there's quite a few. But if you live in the Dunbar area, a little farther west of here, or in the Hastings Sunrise area, there are some places where there are no accessible food assets. And even when there are a lot on this list, some of those might be once a week meals or a food bank that you can access once a month or so. And so it will still not meet all of somebody's food needs. And so one initiative that was started 15, 20 years ago is the neighborhood food networks. So Vancouver is divided up into different neighborhoods, and each of them has a food network. This Trinity-Grace is part of the Mount Pleasant Food Network. So yeah, we still are. Although 411 Senior Center is in Riley Park, but they're still part of the network as well. I'm not sure why there isn't a network for a couple of the parts of Vancouver, but this is actually quite a unique model. I don't know of other cities across North America or beyond who have a network quite like this. But what we know is that if we want to move the needle on some of these big questions, and especially around vulnerabilities like food access, we have got to work together. And networking doesn't just happen. Somebody has got to pull people together to get us in the room together to talk about some of these kind of issues. And so the Vancouver Food Networks, they have 4 big commitments: food security for all, education and engagement, building community, and food justice and sovereignty. So here in Mount Pleasant, as I mentioned, we have the Mount Pleasant Food Network. So there's a couple of organizations that are part of this. So Trinity-Grace is up there. NADA, which was a zero-waste grocery store, but they're not there anymore. This list needs to be updated. The Oasis Cafe, which are the community meals run out of 10th Church. I got to coordinate those for a couple years. So every Monday evening and Tuesday lunch, they open up their space to folks from the neighborhood. When I started coordinating, these meals had already existed for at least a decade. There was a lot of people coming, some good momentum, some good engagement, but they were crowded, and I walked away exhausted. I had a colleague who had a concussion, and she would have to leave the room for a while. And so we got to stop the meals for a bit, which is always hard, and spend 2 months talking about how we serve food. And what we ultimately did was shift it from, we had a room just slightly bigger than this, where we would set up tables and chairs for about 90 people. And we eventually shifted that to setting up tables and chairs for about 45 people, but extending the time that we served. And so it had to feel much more like this, as opposed to more of a soup kitchen feel. Vancouver Farmers Market, they're an important part of food access in this neighborhood. The Mount Pleasant Neighborhood House, Soul Food. So some of these organizations are more concerned with growing food, others with rescuing food, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And so a couple more terms. One is a food desert. So that is a neighborhood without a grocery store within walking distance. And for those who don't have a car, that becomes quite important. Or a food swamp. And so that's a neighborhood where your only options are fast food or corner stores or maybe drugstores where you maybe can get some food, but very limited fresh food, very limited fruit and vegetables or protein or the kind of things that our bodies really need. And in a food mirage is a neighborhood where your only access to food is a very expensive grocery store. So like South Granville, where they've got Mine Hearts, which is quite nice, but if you're on a limited budget, you should not be shopping there. Another initiative that the city is doing is looking at our corner grocery stores. And so while they don't have always the whole variety of foods, we also don't want to be losing them. We don't want a city that's just full of Safeways and Tim Hortons, because these little grocery stores provide some important access. And so somebody's been mapping our little corner stores and doing some work to ensure that they continue to exist, because we really need some of these stores. We don't always want to, walk for 15 minutes or have to drive somewhere when we need a bit of milk or something for our dinner. So rescued food, rescued or recovered food, this is another term that we talk about when we talk about food access. And so that is food that would otherwise go to waste, and it's rescued and somehow diverted and given to a charitable program. Often the quality is poor and it is not a solution to food security. But I will also say that having been around food programs for a while, the quality is sometimes amazing. We get some really amazing food donated. And Vancouver has a zero waste goal. So by 2040, we want to become zero waste. Do you think it's possible? Where are we at? Yeah. That is a good question. The city is working on measuring it, finding ways. And so if you look up the Greenest City strategy, they are measuring this. We had made some really good strides toward it. And then with COVID, we took several steps back because we started using more disposable dishes, single-use items. There was a program the city had set up, if you remember a couple years ago, that every time we used a paper cup, we had to pay the cafe 25 cents for that. And that cafe could keep that money, and they were supposed to put it into greening up their operations in some way, moving towards this zero waste target. Our current administration did not think that that was important, and so that 25-cent fee is abolished now. But as we think about the food access, or the food that goes to waste, we need to think about this. But again, from a dignity perspective, rescued food cannot be the main answer to food insecurity. So food recovery, the neighborhood food networks we talked about a little bit, they put together a series of briefs that they are presenting to City Council. They have given to City Council, and there's a meeting in January where they are saying these are some of the big issues that you need to be aware of and need to help us as the community food organizations sort out in this city. And so this list here, there are quite a few organizations working in food rescue: Food Stash, Vancouver Food Runners, Quest, Second Harvest, Better Life, City Reach, Salvation Army, UBC Sprouts, that's a group up at UBC providing meals. We had a meeting, I think last Monday, with representatives from a number of these different organizations where we just got together virtually to talk about some of the issues, because in some ways these organizations are competitors. We're competing for the best donations, for the grants, for the best reputation, but in a larger way we are all working together for the same goal of A, reducing waste, and B, ensuring that those who are hungry have access to food. So one of the issues that this group is working on is each one has relationships with different grocery stores and food distributors, and when some of them want to take a break, like the UBC Sprouts, for example, they want to stop their programming from about mid-December when the students are in exams to about mid-January, because UBC campus is pretty empty for those couple weeks. But all that food that they are picking up every day or every week, they can't just stop picking it up because it's got to go somewhere. And so they are working with Vancouver Food Runners, which is a pretty innovative organization, to help redistribute that food so somebody else can make use of it. Food Runners, what they do is they don't have any of their own food programs, but they use an app where, I can't remember the number, but they have hundreds of people signed up, people who are willing to help transport the food.
because it's storage and transportation that is the biggest concern for food access. And so they have people who say, I live in Mount Pleasant and I'll be available every Tuesday between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. Or people put their availability into this app, and then you get a notification anytime a restaurant or a catering company or a grocery store would call them and say, we have food available, and then Food Stash sends that note to everyone or Food Runners sends that note to everyone who would be available for that, and then somebody will claim the job, and then they go to the restaurant and deliver it. And their goal is that food would always be delivered to an agency within 5 kilometers. And so we don't want to be driving good food all the way across the city. But I want to point out that these organizations work together, and they figured that in 2022, they collectively rescued 4.93 million pounds of food that would otherwise go to waste, which has a dollar value of 15.8 million, and this is just Vancouver, although this is also 2022 food prices, which also mitigates over 2.6 million pounds of carbon dioxide. And so we use a lot of energy to grow food, and when we just waste that food, we also waste the energy. And so those are staggering numbers, and I'm sure that isn't even all the food that's out there. So food sovereignty, now we're going to start to talk about justice a little bit. So that is people's right to a food system in which those who produce, who distribute, and who consume the food also control the mechanisms and the policies of production and distribution. And so, especially as we start to think about reconciliation and our Indigenous communities, the original ancestors of the land, ideas like this become very important. If we're going to say we're committed to reconciliation, we also need to think through the access to food. And one example of this, I grew up in Abbotsford. My parents, both on my mom's and dad's side of the family, grew up in Yarrow, in the Sumas Prairie. And it was my ancestors who drained the Sumas Lake. And so I grew up with always hearing the story of this amazing feat of engineering, of draining this lake and creating this amazing farmland, which helped my great-grandparents, who came to Canada as very poor refugees, helped them establish, which meant that my parents could go to university, which meant that it never occurred to me that I wouldn't go to university and get to spend my time thinking about issues like this and not doing the real heavy work. And it's only, well, it was 2 years ago this week or so that lake flooded, and I think that we thought it was BC's most natural, or that the farmland flooded, the lake, the water came back, BC's most expensive natural disaster. But now we're talking about how we stole basically the grocery store from the Indigenous people, where they lost their fishing grounds, a lot of the hunting and foraging that they did around that lake. And so that's a very different story than the one I grew up with. And as we talk about food sovereignty, we also talk about food justice, which is a holistic view of our food system that sees healthy food as a human right, as Shadia mentioned, and addresses some of the structural barriers to that right. And so I've got a quote here. Inspired by Jesus, creating a sanctuary of nourished spirits and community growth in a kinder and more just world is our mission. Does anyone recognize that?
I do.
Whose mission is that?
It's ours.
Yeah, yes, I took that from your website. And this community.
Just saying. We know things that wasn't your question. We gotta put it on a t-shirt. There's only
Yeah, that's right. And so I think it's a beautiful commitment. I like the way you say a kinder and more just world. And so part of seeking that just world is thinking about food access especially for our more vulnerable neighbors. There's a quote by a British writer, and his name is escaping me, but he says, "The world is a kinder place than I expected, but far less just." I would guess that most of us in the room have either donated to, volunteered at some kind of food program, and that's good, but we also need to be thinking about justice and what does this mean on a larger scale. So now, zooming out, these are national stats, why we need to think about different races. And these infographics and data comes from an organization called Proof, which is out of the University of Toronto, and they're probably the ones to point to who have the best data on food insecurity in Canada. And they have identified pre-COVID, we thought about 1 in 8 Canadians was food insecure. Now we think it's about 1 in 6, which is a pretty big jump. And we are still exploring the impact of COVID. But they have estimated that almost 1 in 3 Indigenous people living off reserve in 2021 were food insecure, which is higher than the national average. And in that orange box says that about 10% of white households in Canada are food insecure, and about 28% of black households. And so for those who have a black background, and those are a lot of issues that are common. Some of it is access to education, some of it is even home ownership. If you have inherited your home from your parents, or at least inherited, if they're able to help you buy a home, you're a lot more secure. Whereas if you didn't have a home, living costs are a lot more expensive. And somebody was just telling me a story about somebody in the community who lost their home and then is in the process of moving to Saskatchewan because they can't find a home here. And in the map of Canada, the darker red just shows higher levels of food insecurity. And so all across Canada, we're struggling with this, but in the north especially. So this is a map of disproportionately impacted populations. So you'll recognize this is Vancouver. The darker the color, the more barriers people face. So that's income, single-parent families, limited English, being a senior, all of those are connected with more vulnerability. And so I think it's really interesting that people are mapping some of these vulnerabilities in different ways. And what surprised me when I looked at this is there's an area around Arbutus, which I would not have thought of that as one of the more vulnerable neighborhoods. But there's some darker colors around this. Mount Pleasant, where we live, it's more yellow. So there definitely is some vulnerability, and we'll look at some of those numbers in a bit. But not as vulnerable compared to different parts of Vancouver. Anything else you notice on this map or that you're curious about? So the white sections are First Nations Reserve, the gray are parks and open spaces, or some kind of green space. This map is from the Vancouver Plan, which you can find online, and that's some work that's been recently completed, sort of Vancouver's plan for the next 30 years. And so they're looking for a lot of how do we make this a very safe and resilient and green city. The city really has done some great work around this.
It's almost as though East Vancouver, there seems to be a sharp division between red and yellow.
Mm-hmm.
And then into southeast and southwest Vancouver also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and there's many more ways we could explore. In fact, you could have a lunch and learn every Sunday every Sunday in 2024, exploring the different vulnerabilities that this map is pointing to.
Well, it used to be the
Mm-hmm.
And given the price of housing nowadays, there's so much interconnection between food insecurity, housing insecurity, employment insecurity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, food, housing, employment, they all go together.
Just a question, is it able to take into consideration people renting not in formal suites? Because our experience is that we have people in the community living in unofficial suites that would indicate some vulnerability that may not be mapped.
Mm-hmm. There is a lot of, data is important. It teaches us a lot. It should help us think and get creative, but there's a lot of people that we can't measure, a lot of vulnerabilities that we can't measure. Those, we can get a snapshot of who is homeless, who lives in informal suites. We have an estimation of Indigenous people living on and off reserve, but according to their practices, they're not quite as settled. They do tend to move around more. And so, data only tells part of the story. Yeah. There. So there is a lot of really good work being done about Indigenous food systems. I know the United Church and this community in particular has done a lot of work and understanding, and so I am no expert on this, but this is part of the conversation as we think about food security, food access. Indigenous food systems, they tend to be circular. They can use the medicine wheel, which is, I think, a really helpful framework. And one thing that we could learn from our Indigenous community is that they see the land and the waterways, the plants, as sacred in ways that even those of us from a faith community have much to learn. If we take care of the land, it will take care of us. And so this is just a couple of examples. Oh, I'm going to point this at the right. There we go. The City of Vancouver has their UNDRIP strategy, which stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So the city is working on this, coming up with a strategy with our Indigenous neighbors to ensure that First Peoples of this land have food access, and not just adequate food, and definitely not rescued or food bank food, but food that they can access in ways that honor their traditions and their food sovereignty. And just one example of this is the Vancouver Urban Food Forest Foundation. So they're working on getting more food forests around the city. So when we talk about food security, we also need to talk about our food culture. So that's the beliefs, the values, the customs, the norms, laws, practices, including our storytelling, our art making, our institutions, our habits related to how, what, when, where we eat. So food shapes our experience of the world and thus each other. There is some work being done right now to identify and ensure that we preserve our cultural food assets. And so as rent gets more expensive, we're at risk of losing some of our little Filipino restaurants and Asian produce stores, and but those are so much of what makes Vancouver an interesting city. We like to be able to find food from different places. We like to have a Syrian lunch when we gather for an event like this. We don't want a world full of just fast food and big conglomerations. And so this is also important to pay attention to our neighborhood food assets and make sure that we don't lose them. So I got to work with the Mount Pleasant Food Network. We finished this in February 2022 on what we call it a neighborhood asset and needs scan. And so what we did was just call anybody who would answer our phone call basically, or who would meet with us, and ask them, what are you seeing in the neighborhood? What kind of food program are you providing? And what are the needs that you're seeing? What do you need to keep going? Who here is at home in Mount Pleasant? bunch of us, yeah. And so just a couple of stats about Mount Pleasant, and these were taken from the 2016 census, so a couple years plus COVID will have definitely changed, but our population, 32,955 then. About 18% of people in Mount Pleasant, or about 6,000 people, live below the poverty line, which means struggling to access food and all those other basic necessities, let alone secure housing. 40% of rented households, they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So 30% is about what would be reasonable, but if you have to spend more than 30% of your income, then that starts to cut into your ability both just for daily living, and budget shocks is what we call when somebody has a big expense. So maybe you need some emergency dental work done, or your car needs some significant work. When you have a large expense, most of us, maybe we could handle that once, but more than once could sink us. And I think I heard a stat recently that for the average Vancouverite, it would cost us 97.5% of our salary to get into a house, which is a little overwhelming. Another stat about Mount Pleasant, 28% of the families in Mount Pleasant are lone parent, single parent families. And the majority of those would be female-led, so single mom, not all of them. But as you can imagine, single parent, they've got to be balancing work with childcare. If your kid gets sick, you have to take a day off of work and get food in the house and all the other tasks. Plus, be feeding little ones, which can be expensive. Yeah?
Karen, what's the current dollar value of the definition of poverty?
Oh, that is a good question.
Probably changes on a yearly basis.
Yeah, and there's a couple of different ways to measure where the poverty line is. Yeah, I don't have that number at my fingertips. It is available. And we talk about an annual income on one level. We talk about a living wage on another level. So there's minimum wage, and then there's a living wage, and there's a big gap there. Yeah, it's a good question. I'll do some homework.
Thank you.
So when we asked all the food providers in Mount Pleasant, who do you see as being underserved? They told us homeless individuals, seniors, individuals with mental health challenges, Indigenous individuals, those who are isolated, and vulnerable youth. So there is a place for just an open food program, and while our basic nutrition needs are the same, there are some particular needs and ways of supporting each individual community. And so there are some groups who work just specifically with some of these vulnerable populations, but there's a lot more potential to work with them. Just a couple of key lessons, and I have a copy of this Invisible Visible report, or it's available online if anyone wants to read it a little more closely. And we named it Invisible Visible because it was a comment that one of the food providers said, is that while this neighborhood is not one of the more vulnerable ones in the city, when we think about poverty and people who are really struggling, we more think of the downtown east side, but there are people in this neighborhood who are struggling, and so they are sort of the invisible visible in our community. And so, although not a new lesson, and these were conversations we had about a year ago when we were thinking about the pandemic a little bit more, the pandemic helped us realize in a deeper way that people are hungry for community. Support such as community meals can be key initial connections for those who are otherwise struggling and isolated. And so a few other pandemic lessons, and I'm just going to highlight two of them that we heard as we talked to providers, and some who were from the faith community, some who weren't. But several interviewees talked about their desire to give in a human way, to provide basic needs, particularly for food, in ways that create connection and satisfies a deeper hunger. And I imagine that deeper hunger is one that you've talked about often here on Sunday mornings, and as you've planned for the gatherings that happened here on Saturday, the community lunch that used to host, the connection with the 411 Senior Center now. But to satisfy this deeper hunger, to create a space where we can do that, it takes significant time, outreach skills, often tangible resources, like the tables and chairs and food that we can bring in, the dishwasher. One service provider observed that we miss something significant when we only eat with those we know and who are not food insecure. Others talked about the value of volunteers who are not task-focused, but who can sit down and chat with the program guests. Another key lesson from the pandemic is related to mental health. This is something we're all talking about quite a bit. It was a stressful time, and for anyone who was already struggling with mental health, those challenges were just amplified. So several people we talked to for this report talked about what we have learned and we are continuing to learn about mental health. We have focused more on physical health. We were all talking about what do we do to keep ourselves safe. But the pandemic has affected mental health in huge ways, increasing fear and anxiety and isolation. And so these challenges are particularly felt by people who already had few supports in place. Vancouver has what we call the Healthy City Strategy. Has anyone heard of it? It's worth looking up, reading a little bit about, but Vancouver has identified some very, I think, important and tangible goals to make this place healthy for all of us. And so one of the goals they've identified is that all of us would live within a 5 or 10 minute walk of some kind of park or green space, because we need to get out and see nature once in a while. Even when it's raining, it's still worth getting out. And although that's not a law, but when a developer submits an application to build a new building or change something, that is one thing that will be considered, is that if we put a new apartment, can people who live there still access a park? Another goal that Vancouver has is that all of us would have at least 4 people we can call when we need support. And that really struck me when I read this. And for those of us who are part of a faith community, who have family nearby, who have been here for a long time and know our neighbors, we could probably list 40 people that we would trust to give our keys to water our plants while we're away, or bring us groceries when we're down with COVID, or other ways that we need just little bits of support. If you accidentally lock yourself out of your apartment and your neighbor has keys, you can get in easily. If nobody else has a key and you have to call a locksmith, there's $200, and that, for anyone who's vulnerable, that will come out of your food budget. So My Health, My Community is another survey done of people in Vancouver. And so I looked up a few stats about Mount Pleasant. So in Mount Pleasant, 51.9% of people said they had at least 4 people in their network that they could confide in, or tell their problems, or call if they needed help, which means that almost half of Mount Pleasant don't feel like they have 4 people that they can call. And when I used to run the food programs, the community meals in Mount Pleasant, whenever any of my volunteers complained about how much work it was to wash the dishes or take the compost out, I would remind them of the stat. And anytime, it does feel like some of these tasks are drudgerous. Part of the reason we do this is to build up these support networks. A couple other little stats about Mount Pleasant. 33% said they had eaten 5 or more servings of fruit or vegetables in the past day. As a dietitian, if I could only ask you one question to assess the state of your health and how healthy your diet is, it would be, how many vegetables have you eaten in the past 24 hours? And if only 33% of people in this neighborhood have eaten 5 or more servings, that means that 66% haven't. Some of that is because of budget, some of that is choice. But if there is one thing that you could do to improve your health, it would probably just up your vegetable intake a little bit.
Well, chocolate and coffee are both beans.
They are both beans, yep, and they are part of a good, enjoyable diet. We say food is really two things. It's fuel and it's pleasure. Another stat, 55% of people in Mount Pleasant say that their mental health is excellent or very good, which means that almost half of us can't say that our mental health is average, is excellent or good. Just interestingly, the Vancouver average is 52%. So our mental health here in Mount Pleasant is slightly higher than average, but it is something we need to consider as we think about our community. In Mount Pleasant, almost 19% said a doctor had diagnosed them with one or more of the following: diabetes, heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, chronic breathing. And so back to the comment somebody made earlier, if you have any of these conditions, diabetes or pre-diabetes or heart challenges, you can't necessarily eat all the food that's available at a food program because it often is quite processed, quite high in sodium, high in sugar. And so it is more expensive to eat with some of these health challenges. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the response to food insecurity does come from the faith community. Well over 50 faith communities across Vancouver provide some kind of food program. Churches are an amazing asset in that we have tables and chairs and kitchens and dishwashers and plates and a committed, caring group of individuals. We often have a budget to do something. We have a commitment to justice and reconciliation, and there are some really great responses, as well as a lot of practices that we could nudge into ways that are meeting people's needs a little bit more culturally appropriately. You know, one of the questions when a church runs a community meal is, it is our practice to pray before we eat. So should we invite all our guests to do that because that's our tradition? Or should we say, well, our guests won't necessarily pray, so we might pray as volunteers, but not with the guests. There's no right or wrong way to do that, although I have seen it done in very respectful and invitational ways, and I've also seen it done in ways that make me cringe, and I am a person of faith. But one last stat I want to share is the Cardis Institute, which is a research institute back east somewhere. They have determined that for every dollar that a religious community church spends, there's about $3.39 in benefit to Canadian communities. And so with our tithes, we pay the salaries of our staff of these buildings, we pay the rent. There is benefit to the community in that we have these available spaces, we can respond to some of the needs, we're learning together, we're celebrating together, bringing people together to sing Christmas carols. There might not be a direct connection to food insecurity through some of those kind of things, but all of that builds up the social connections that we need to live and to thrive. So, thank you. Those are that was a lot to fly through. Any questions, responses?
I like your definition of tranquility.
Tranquility is the income to afford your whole grocery bill. Yeah. If we've experienced or seen someone who the bill was higher than expected and they had to go put something back, it's stressful, it's shameful, it's discouraging.
Karen, I'm old enough to remember actually when food banks started in Vancouver. Vanderzen was the premier at the time, and there was this expectation that the food bank was a temporary measure. And Vanderzen's response was, well, eventually the churches will take over. And food banks have become and churches are still there.
Yeah.
It's a whole vicious cycle. Poverty, I think, is the root of homelessness, food insecurity, mental health issues.
Isolation, yeah. Yeah, we know that people will only cease to be food insecure when they have an adequate income. And so advocating for basic income, for adequate minimum wage, living wage, disability benefits, seniors benefits. In fact, we saw when people become seniors and are eligible for the guaranteed income supplement and pensions, food security usually increases. Or when people were able to access CERB and some of the other pandemic benefits, their ability to access food increases. We know this works. But best case scenario, it might take us 10 years to get those policies in place, and we cannot leave people struggling today. Yeah.
Well, doesn't it have to do with the rental fees? Like, how can you pay that kind of rent that Vancouver is charging now and be food secure? It just.
Right. Yeah, so food and housing.
Yeah, is there any kind of real push to bring down the rental fees? Is there anything going on?
That is a great question. Can you organize someone to talk about housing next week? I've heard the line, what gets measured gets done. And so we do need to be understanding some of these. And so we were just chatting. First United, the Mission downtown east side, has just done some eviction mapping. And so asked a bunch of people and got a lot of data around people losing their homes. And in their report, they put out some recommendations. You can find that online, or the Vancouver Sun recently put out a good summary of it. And one of their recommendations was saying, Vancouver currently has some laws saying that landlords can only increase the rent by a certain amount per year. It was about 4%, then for a few years it was nothing, and then now last year it was 2% something. Which landlords are saying, this, as our mortgage rates are going up, this makes it difficult for us, but for tenants we need this security. But when a tenant decides to move, then the landlords can change the rent to anything they want. And so one of the recommendations that First United made is saying the city needs to put some limits on how much the rent can be increased.
We need to have limits on rent evictions too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rent eviction is a word that we're throwing around. There are rules around landlords can only ask a tenant to leave if they're going to move in themselves or their family, or they're selling a place, or they're going to do significant work on the suite. In good faith, we need to trust that most landlords are honest about that, but if there is some rules saying if a landlord is not honest about that and they get caught, they have to give the tenant that they evicted a year's worth of rent or something. But yeah, we can't always monitor and catch. But there is some work being done around this.
Karen, first of all, I'm very impressed. I mean, me and Karen meet often, and she's listening. She listens well. So she knows a lot of what we're doing, and a lot of it is also to your connection as well. You've helped us in the food network as well. And Anthony, I think, is an indirect connection, the food to plate. So there's a lot of intersections happening. My question is perhaps maybe not directly related to the data, but have community gardens, like what is the role? Have community gardens in any ways contributed to?
How do community gardens make an impact? I mean, every vegetable makes a difference, especially when they're fresh and local and tasty and in season. I would say that our home gardens, our community gardens, they don't contribute a significant amount of the calories that we consume. We still need all the staples. We still need our grocery stores. We still need to be able to afford big bag of groceries every week, but they contribute, community gardens and any way we grow contribute significantly to our mental health, hopefully to building social connections. I met a friend for dinner, must have been, it was one of the hot days in summer, and we chose a restaurant near Oak and 16th, which was between us. The food was good, but it was so hot inside this restaurant, and so we decided we would take our food to go. There was no park nearby, so we went and sat in that community garden that's right at Oak and 16th. It's, I think, one of the older ones in the city, and it was lovely. If you haven't visited, go make yourself a cup of tea and sit there. We had some great conversations with each other, with some of the other people coming through. They are a significant asset for our community. So significant, but not necessarily, they're not the answer to food insecurity, but it's part of the solution. And also, if we try to grow anything, we realize how hard it is. It's pretty amazing how much food flows through the city and all the work behind that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my experience is that is an experiment in food insecurity. You can't keep a carrot in the ground in the community garden. But that's another lunch and learn too. But my question, I was looking at the food waste numbers, and that, so I'm still surprised. I'm surprised in a way that it's still so high given the relative expense. So for a long time, people, I know it might not seem like this, but I mean, before all this recent inflation, compared to other places in the world, North America, in terms of percentage of earnings going to, our food is relatively cheap compared to places like in Europe. A lot of places in the world, people pay a lot more what they earn to buy food. And so there was talk about, in terms of changing our agricultural system and changing things, and maybe if people paid a bit more for stuff, if some of that went back to the people who actually grew it, and also if it's too cheap, maybe you don't value it. So you buy too much and you just throw it away, it's not a big deal. Seeing it as how things are so much more expensive now, and we've been hearing with grocery people being dragged in front of House and Commons and stuff, that idea of, you're paying a bit more, but it's not necessarily going back to the people who produced it, or fair conditions for the people who pick it or prepare it and that sort of stuff. There's this concentration in grocery. And even when they buy up the smaller grocery chains, their stores, they'll keep the original names on, but it isn't your local grocery store anymore. So yeah, there's this idea that if things were a little bit more costly, maybe some of the waste would go down. That would be a good thing. But have you tracked? The waste seems to be I bet you it's the same. But seeing that dollar amount, that's very.
It's staggering, yeah.
And that is one of the advantages of measuring.
Yeah.
But the waste doesn't seem to be going down.
There is a campaign called Love Food, Hate Waste, where Metro Vancouver is trying to address food waste. And some of that is learning to use our food scraps. One of the terms I heard was stock posting, which is taking some food scraps that you might just throw into the compost, but making soup stock out of them instead. There's lots of little things that we can do to minimize waste. But we've got to work at it at the household level, at the grocery store level, at the systemic level. Yeah, it's complex. And so, how do we respond? Yeah.
Last Saturday night here, Jack and I and David came to a showing of the Insecurity, that chef TJ.
Oh, Interloopers, the film, yeah.
Yeah, and I think he said that it was only 25% of the food is being rescued. Yeah. And the food that he had coming into it was in COVID that he started taking it in from restaurants. I think he had a restaurant himself. Yeah. And they made this amazing food which they gave out downtown. And I mean, incredible food. And I think there's something called Reroute, which they make food like soups and that, and they freeze it out of this. And in the US, we've just had a little hole in the wall cafe or food distributor. It's done through UGM. Kitchen is used in the US, and they have the chef that trains the sous chefs.
Oh yeah, working with some of the youth.
At risk. They're at
yeah.
risk.
Little kiosk, yeah.
It's $4.50, and it was enough soup to feed David and I, and there was a bun each as well. So there's all kinds. There's this process. We just need to get, cities and province involved. Is if there were kitchens that could be used, say off-peak hours,
Mm-hmm.
and then train these people, they'd be getting skills, which we're always saying, oh, the restaurants haven't got enough people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're so proud of what they're doing. It's really great to see these young people. They're learning a business, how to run a business. It's incredible, and it would solve so many problems as well as using up a lot of this. So I guess we have to get vocal with their politicians and their cities, but they're taking in more young people. So they need learning young people that need some training.
Mm-hmm.
They get a practicum, and very often they get a job at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just like a
Yeah.
great circle.
Yeah. Surplus food is not our limiting factor, and need is not our limiting factor, and kitchen space is not our limiting factor, and people who can cook are not our limiting factor. It's bringing all of these together. And there are some really cool examples, and so we need to continue just to get curious, to learn, be grateful for all the food that we do have, and look out for our neighbors. And
support these organisations and buy food there, because
yeah.
it's beneficial to everybody. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's affordable for most people, not everybody, but
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to add, I think we work
Shirley, can
with
you come out and talk, because we can't hear you back
he
here.
works with the Vancouver food runners.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, of course. And I think the same app, you mentioned an app, is it the same one that people if people put like food to pick up or deliver? That's the same one?
So Food Runners is where volunteers will help get food from where it's excess to where it's needed. There are a number of other apps, like there's one, Too Good To Go, where you can sign up, and grocery stores or restaurants will say, tonight between 6 and 8 p.m. we have 5 bags, and these bags are, we pay $5 or $6 for them, and they're supposed to have about $25 worth of food. You don't know what you're going to get, but it helps us access a bit of food, helps give at least $5 worth of income to the grocery store. I've used it a few times. Thankfully, I have an income, and I didn't find the quality worth my time. Often you just get a whole lot of bread, or one day I got a pepper and organic squash, some very ripe bananas, and some noodles, or good food, but I would have needed to spend more money, or I did spend more money on other ingredients to make a meal, and then the more aware we get of limiting food waste, especially at a grocery store level, because when we walk into a grocery store, we want to see full shelves, and if the shelves aren't full, we think there's something wrong. We're just used to that. But for the grocery store to do that, that means there will be more waste, but as food costs go up, that will go down, and we are starting to see a few more empty shelves, and we need to consider that as normal. Or bakeries. If you walk into a bakery at 5 p.m. and there's only a few loaves of bread, we think there's something wrong, but
It's actually a good thing.
it is a good thing, yeah. It means it won't be as much. So the better grocery stores get at forecasting, that means that there is less food to be rescued, and so our food charities can't rely on this. Yeah, it's
As long as that works for the growers, or if it doesn't work for the growers, if there's another network
mm-hmm.
for those growers to use,
Right, yeah, because when there is, when all the tomatoes are coming ripe, when all the Brussels sprouts are ripe, we can't bring those to market soon enough.
Or you hear those stories